Hey, before we begin, if you find yourself drifting off tonight, that means we're doing something right. Take a moment to like the video if this kind of calm, unhurried history is your thing. And subscribe if you'd like more. Drop a comment and let us know where you heard about this video. A late night search, a recommendation, a rabbit hole that brought you somewhere unexpected. We love knowing how people find their way here. Now, get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let's step into a world that was far stranger and far more dangerous than most of us realize. If you woke up tomorrow in the Middle Ages, you probably wouldn't survive 24 hours. Not because of knights, not because of war, not because someone with a sword would find you wandering confused in a cobblestone street. Those things happened, certainly, but they weren't the everyday danger. The thing that would most likely kill you in the Middle Ages was something far more ordinary. Something people did every single morning without thinking about it. Something you did this morning, in fact. You reached for a drink of water, and that's where your 24 hours would begin to run out. Picture a medieval town in the year 1200. Not a Hollywood town of gleaming stone and spotless market stalls, but the real thing. Narrow streets packed with timber-framed houses leaning toward each other overhead. The spaces between them dark even at noon. The smell arrives before everything else. It is a dense, compound smell, the kind that has layers you discover in sequence as you stand in it longer. There is the smell of animals, horses and pigs and chickens moving freely through the same streets where people walk and sleep and eat. There is the smell of the river, which moves sluggishly through the center of town and serves simultaneously as the water supply, the laundry facility, the waste disposal system, and the place where the tanneries upstream deposit their runoff of hides and fat and animal blood. There is the smell of the houses themselves, where rushes and straw are spread across the floors to absorb what accumulates over weeks of daily life before being replaced. You are thirsty. You slept badly on a straw pallet that is home to more organisms than you. And your mouth is dry, and the most natural thing in the world is to walk down to the river and drink. This is the decision that would end you. Medieval people drew their drinking water from rivers, wells, and communal springs. These sources were not protected in any meaningful sense from the activities that surrounded them. Civic records from London, Paris, and virtually every major medieval city contain ordinances prohibiting the dumping of waste into the water supply, which tells you two things simultaneously. First, that people understood, at least vaguely, that something about the water and something about illness were connected. And second, that people dumped waste into the water supply constantly, regardless, because the ordinances were written and rewritten and still largely ignored. The river that would provide your morning drink had, upstream, the output of the tanneries. Tanning leather requires soaking hides in vats of dog feces. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. This is what tanning requires. And this waste, along with the animal offal from the butchers, and the human waste from the cesspits that leaked into the groundwater, and the dead animals that were sometimes simply thrown in because no one had time to bury them. All of it moved downstream and mixed with the water that came out of your cup. The diseases that lived in that water were not subtle in their effects. Dysentery caused by bacterial contamination of drinking water was so common in the medieval world that it rarely even gets mentioned in chronicles unless it killed someone important. It was like weather. It was the background condition of medieval existence. You had it, you recovered, if you were lucky. You had it again. Typhoid fever. A more serious bacterial infection also spread through contaminated water, causes sustained high fever, severe abdominal pain, and in somewhere between 10 and 20% of untreated cases, death. These were not exotic diseases. They were not rare. They were the predictable consequence of drinking water that was shared with the waste of thousands of people and animals. Medieval people were not stupid, and they were not entirely unaware of this problem. The solution they developed was elegant in its way, and it worked. They drank beer instead of water. Not strong beer by modern standards, but small beer. A weak, lightly fermented ale brewed from grain and water. The brewing process required boiling, which killed most of the harmful bacteria in the water. The fermentation that followed produced a small amount of alcohol and, more importantly, an acidic environment that was hostile to the pathogens that thrived in untreated river water. Everyone drank it: men, women, children, infants. A medieval monastery might allocate a gallon of beer per monk per day as a standard ration, not because medieval monks were drunks, but because a gallon a week beer was a safer daily fluid intake than a gallon of river water. It was practical, and it worked reasonably well for people who had grown up with it and whose systems had adapted to it over a lifetime. You, arriving from the 21st century, had not grown up with it. Your immune system has never encountered the specific pathogens that have coexisted with medieval people for generations. The bacteria that a 13th century peasant's gut handles with minimal disruption could put you in bed within hours and in a grave within a week. And that's just the water. That's just the first problem. That's just the beginning. After surviving your morning drink, you'd need to find somewhere to clean yourself. Here is where the popular image of medieval life gets complicated in an interesting way. The common assumption that medieval people simply never bathed and considered cleanliness unimportant is not quite accurate. Medieval people understood the connection between dirt and disease better than they are usually given credit for. Etiquette manuals from the period advised washing hands before and after meals as a basic social expectation. Most towns of any size had public bathhouses, establishments that offered hot water bathing as a regular service, used by people across the social spectrum. The church didn't oppose bathing. There was no theological objection to cleanliness. The idea that medieval Christians refused to wash because the body was sinful is a myth that was invented later and applied backward. But there is a significant gap between understanding that cleanliness is desirable and being able to achieve it with the tools available. A public bathhouse in a medieval town heated its water over fire, and the same water was often used by multiple bathers in sequence, cooling and being refreshed only partially between uses. The very thing that made bathhouses convenient, shared hot water, made them efficient distribution systems for skin diseases, fungal infections, and anything else that traveled between one person's skin and the next. Lice were not a sign of poverty or failure to try. They were a fact of life at every level of medieval society. King Henry I of England was reportedly afflicted with them. The letters and diaries of educated, comfortable people referenced them as a normal inconvenience to be managed, not a source of particular shame. Fleas were the same, present in bedding and floor rushes, in the fur linings of wealthy garments, in the thatch of roofs where birds nested. They were part of the indoor landscape of the period in a way that is genuinely difficult for a modern person to imagine. For you, arriving with a modern immune system that has no experience of the specific parasites and skin pathogens circulating in a 13th century town, the fleas and lice would not merely be itchy. They were vectors. The plague, when it came, traveled on the fleas that traveled on the rats that traveled through every building in every European city. Typhus traveled the same way. A flea bite was not simply uncomfortable. It was a potential delivery mechanism for something catastrophic. Your skin, unaccustomed to the microbial environment of the medieval world, would begin registering its objections within hours. But let us suppose you managed the water and survived the bathhouse, and now you are hungry and you need to eat something. The medieval diet, for most people, was centered on bread. Bread was not a supplement to the meal, it was the meal. An ordinary peasant might derive 3/4 of their daily calories from bread, supplemented with pottage, which was a thick stew made from whatever was available. Legumes, vegetables, occasionally meat if the household was prosperous, usually not. For feast days or particular celebrations, there might be roasted meat. For ordinary days, there was bread. The bread was made from rye in much of Northern Europe because wheat was more expensive and rye grew in worse conditions. Rye bread sounds straightforward. It was not. Rye is susceptible to a fungus called claviceps purpurea, ergot, in ways that wheat is not, particularly after cold or wet winters when the previous year's grain is still in storage. Ergot replaces individual grain kernels with dark, hard bodies that look similar enough to normal grain that they pass unnoticed into the flour. The ergot alkaloids they contain are related to the compounds from which LSD was later synthesized, which gives you a partial sense of their effects on the human nervous system. Ergotism, the disease caused by consuming ergot-contaminated bread, was common enough in medieval Europe to have its own name, Saint Anthony's fire. The gangrenous form caused intense burning sensations in the limbs, followed by the constriction of blood vessels that cut off circulation to the extremities, followed by dry gangrene, and the limbs literally dying and falling away from the living body. In 994, a single outbreak of ergotism killed an estimated 40,000 people in France. In 944, another outbreak swept through Aquitaine with similar results. These were not isolated incidents. They recurred whenever conditions favored fungal growth in the stored grain, and medieval people had no way to detect contamination before eating it. The meat, if you were fortunate enough to encounter any, came with its own calculations. Medieval cities had regulations governing the sale of meat. London's civic ordinances required that butchers dispose of offal outside the city walls and prohibited the sale of putrid flesh. The records of fines for violating these rules are extensive, which tells you both that the rules existed and that they were regularly broken. Without refrigeration, meat began its journey towards spoilage from the moment the animal was slaughtered. Salting, smoking, and drying could extend usability, but these preservation methods changed the character of the meat substantially and did not eliminate all risk. Fish sold in urban markets was a particular problem. The same regulations that prohibited selling corrupt meat also prohibited selling corrupt fish, and the same court records show the same persistent pattern of fines for doing it anyway, sometimes with the fish re-spiced to disguise the smell of deterioration. One medieval chronicler attributed the death of King Henry I of England in 1135 to what he called a surfeit of lampreys, improperly prepared fish consumed by a man who should have been able to afford better. If it could reach a king's table, it could certainly reach yours. Your stomach, unacclimated to the specific bacterial landscape of medieval food, would not handle any of this easily. Modern digestive systems depend on a microbiome shaped by the particular foods and contaminants we encounter from infancy. Medieval food contained different organisms, different fungi, different levels of spoilage that the bodies of medieval people had calibrated to over generations. You are not calibrated to it. The bread could poison you, the meat could sicken you, the fish could do worse. But let us say you ate carefully, stuck to things that looked fresh, trusted your instincts, and then, toward the end of this difficult day, you felt unwell. You had a fever. You had chills. Something was wrong, and you needed a doctor. This is where your 24 hours would encounter its final, decisive problem. Medieval medicine was not primitive in the sense of being careless or uninformed. It was a coherent, elaborately developed system, grounded in centuries of accumulated thought, practiced by people who were often highly educated by the standards of their time. The problem was not ignorance of the need to understand illness. It was that the conceptual framework they were working within was wrong, in ways they had no means of knowing. The theory that governed medieval medicine was called humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek physicians, Hippocrates and Galen, and regarded as authoritative throughout the medieval period in both Christian Europe and the Islamic world. It held that the human body was composed of 4 fluids called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a state of balance among these 4. Illness was an imbalance. Too much of one, too little of another. The job of the physician was to identify which humor was excessive and correct the imbalance by removing it or counteracting it. This framework was internally logical. It was not superstition, it was theory, developed by careful observers, applied systematically. The problem was that it was wrong. There are no humors. Blood, phlegm, and bile are real substances, but they do not govern health through their proportions. Illness is caused by pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites, none of which had been conceived of, let alone observed, in the medieval period. The gap between what the theory predicted and what the treatment therefore required was, for a feverish patient, potentially fatal. The most common treatment derived from humoral theory was bloodletting. If you were feverish, blood was considered hot, and excess blood was considered the likely cause. The solution was to remove some. A physician, or more commonly, a barber surgeon. Since the surgical aspect of bloodletting was considered beneath the dignity of a university-trained physician, would open a vein, typically at the elbow or wrist, and allow a measured quantity of blood to drain into a bowl. The barber's pole, still seen outside barbershops today, carries its red and white stripes as a direct inheritance from this practice. Red for blood, white for the tourniquet or bandage used afterward. The bloodletting could involve the removal of a few ounces or several liters over the course of days, depending on the physician's assessment. For a patient who is already weakened by infection and fever, the removal of significant volumes of blood reduced the blood pressure, weakened the immune response, and accelerated deterioration. George Washington, as late as 1799, was bled of approximately 5 pints of blood by his physicians over the course of a single day as treatment for what was likely bacterial epiglottitis, a condition that modern antibiotics would have resolved quickly. He died within hours of the final bloodletting. Medieval patients died the same way, with their physicians convinced they were providing the correct treatment because the theory said so. Beyond bloodletting, the medieval physician might prescribe purging, forcing the patient to vomit or to take laxatives. On the same logic, if the excess humor cannot be bled out, perhaps it can be expelled another way. For a patient with a bacterial infection, forced vomiting and diarrhea produce dangerous dehydration. The physician's intervention, sincerely and skillfully applied, made the underlying condition worse. Some medieval remedies worked. Willow bark, containing compounds related to aspirin, genuinely reduces fever and pain. Honey has genuine antimicrobial properties. Some herbal preparations used by folk healers and village women had effects that modern pharmacology has since verified. Medieval medicine was not entirely useless, but the framework that organized it, the theory that decided what treatment was appropriate and when, sent physicians in the wrong direction, as often as the right one. And unlike the water, which you might have navigated with care, and unlike the food, which you might have avoided eating in quantity, the doctor was the person you went to precisely when you were already vulnerable and least able to absorb the consequences of a wrong decision. Doctors, in the medieval world, often made things worse. This is not a harsh judgment on the people involved. They were doing what their training told them to do. They were applying centuries of accumulated medical wisdom as accurately as they could. They simply could not know what they could not know. The germ theory of disease was 600 years away. The microscope was 400 years away. The concept of bacterial infection was not available to them, and without it, the best they could do, the most learned, most careful, most diligent physician of the 13th century, was to proceed from a framework that pointed away from the actual cause of what was killing their patients. So you would arrive in a medieval town, drink the water, encounter the parasites, eat the bread, and reach for the doctor. And at each step, the environment would be working on you in ways that the people around you had adapted to over lifetimes, and you had not. This is what makes the Middle Ages genuinely, substantively dangerous, in a way that doesn't depend on dramatic violence or visible cruelty. The danger was structural. It lived in the infrastructure of daily life, in the shared water and the shared space and the food that had traveled through a distribution system with no concept of bacterial contamination, and the medical system that responded to illness with interventions that frequently compounded it. Medieval people were not helpless. They were not passive victims. They developed real adaptations. The beer instead of water, the salting and smoking of meat, the herbal knowledge accumulated over generations, the practical understanding of which things made you sicker and which things helped. They survived, and many of them lived long lives, because human bodies are more resilient than we typically acknowledge, and because generational exposure to the specific pathogens of their environment built real, if informal, immunity. Their children grew up drinking the beer and eating the bread and sleeping in the flea-infested bedding. And many of them were fine enough, because that was the world they were born into, and their bodies knew it. You were not born into it. You carry an immune system shaped by a different world. A world of antibiotics and clean water and refrigeration and germ theory and vaccination. These things have changed you at the cellular level. The medieval world is not equipped for you, and you are not equipped for it. So no, you would not survive 24 hours. Not because anyone wished you harm, not because you were unlucky, but because the ordinary conditions of daily life in the Middle Ages, the cup of water in the morning, the bread at noon, the doctor in the evening, were genuinely incompatible with the body you walk around in today. And that gap between then and now, that particular and specific gap, measured in clean water and bacterial theory and the simple knowledge that invisible organisms cause disease, is one of the most consequential distances in all of human history. Let that settle quietly around you now. Let the medieval town return to the past where it belongs. Its streets dark, its river moving, its people doing the best they could with everything they had and everything they knew. They were not failed versions of us. They were us, before we knew what we didn't know. And what we've learned since then, the unglamorous, scientific, patient accumulation of knowledge about water and germs, and what actually happens inside a human body when something goes wrong. That knowledge has saved more lives than any army, any medicine chest, any prayer whispered in the dark over a sick child ever did. Sleep well tonight. There is clean water beside your bed if you need it. You live in a remarkable era, even when it doesn't feel like one. If tonight's walk through the dangers of the medieval world gave you something to think about as you drift off, a sense of how much has changed, and how recently, please consider leaving a like and subscribing if you haven't already. It helps this channel find the people who might need exactly this kind of company at the end of a long day. We'll be here next time, somewhere else in history, and just as close to home.